A lot of people think you can only make high quality level brisket by using an offset. But in today's video, I'm going to show you guys how you can replicate a high quality brisket that you would find in barbecue restaurants in Texas, but doing in your own backyard with your Kettle grill. I want to prove that's more about technique than having the right tools for the job. With that being said, let's get started. For this cook, I'm going to start with a smaller prime brisket from Costco, weighing about 12.5 pounds. I went with a smaller brisket than usual because we're going to need to squeeze this thing into a small cooker. Try to pull back the heel fat from the rest of the brisket by creating a gap. Then use the tip of your knife as you peel it away and remove the big chunk of fat. There was also a big gash that was left in the brisket that's going to make that area dry out if we're not careful. So let's take care of that. Since it's a pretty deep gash, start by leveling out the area by taking off a big chunk. And any leftover lingering pieces, use the tip of the knife like we did earlier to create a new flat surface. To finish the bottom of the brisket, take off any thick pieces of fat or silver skin by cutting with the grain of the muscle. Flip the brisket over and take down the mohawk since it will most likely dry out or burn during the cooking process. Stretch and pull on all edges of the brisket to see how wide the flat muscle is and how much you need to trim off for a more uniform shape. Right underneath where we remove the mohawk, there's a lot of loose lean muscle that has no fat coverage and is far too thin. Since that side of the brisket will most likely dry up or burn, I'm going to take it all off and create a new edge for my brisket. Before I go any further, I just wanted to get a general idea of how big this brisket is, because it has to fit in my Kettle grill, which has a diameter of 22 inches. And upon further review, the length of the brisket is good. Finish off the trim by rounding off any sharp edges, take down any excess fat, and double check all sides to see if it needs any final touch-ups. And there you have it, folks. We got a brisket trimmed up and ready to go in the Kettle grill. I sped through this trim pretty quickly, so if you're looking for a super detailed trim video, check out my mastering the brisket trim video I have linked in the top corner for you. Before we move on to the next step, I want to introduce the sponsor of today's video, Magic Spoon. Growing up, eating cereal was kind of like one of my favorite things to eat, but unfortunately, as I got older, I realized it doesn't really fit into my lifestyle anymore. But thankfully, with Magic Spoon, I'm able to enjoy one of my favorite childhood snacks again. Magic Spoon is high protein, keto friendly, gluten free, wheat free, and soy free. It has 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, 4 to 5 grams of net carbs, and it's only 140 calories per serving. And if you're worried that you're gonna get sick of the same flavor over and over again, well, you're in luck because they sell variety packs. They sell 4 different flavors that include fruity, frosted, cocoa, and peanut butter. So do yourself a favor, click the link below to grab a variety pack and try it today. And be sure to use the promo code KNOX at checkout, get $5 off any order, or go to magicspoon.com/KNOX. So click the link below or scan the QR code on the screen. Magic Spoon is so confident in the product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Thanks Magic Spoon for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the cook. In my other brisket videos, I tell you that I'm going to season my brisket with 16 mesh black pepper and diamond crystal salt with a 50-50 ratio by volume. And then I add in a little extra black pepper. To be exact, I have 100 grams of black pepper and 80 grams of salt. But let's take some time and talk about why all that information matters. It doesn't exactly have to be 16 mesh black pepper. I've seen others use a 12 mesh or maybe even a mix of both, but it needs to be a coarser grind. The bigger pieces of pepper will help create a better bark. If your pepper is too fine, you'll be missing out on color and texture on your bark. And if it's too big, it'll most likely fall off or be too spicy if you bite into a big piece of pepper. Diamond crystal salt has a more uniform grain that allows for even distribution. And because the salt grains aren't too big, you can season more aggressively without it tasting too salty. Here's why you can't just do a 50-50 ratio by volume with any kind of salt. This one is Morton's. Both of these are 80 grams, but by volume, Morton's is about half the amount of salt compared to Diamond Crystal. To have the same salt balance if you're using Morton's, it would be more like a 2-to-1 black pepper to salt ratio. So you can imagine, if you did a 50-50 ratio by volume with Morton's, how much saltier your brisket would end up being compared to Diamond Crystal. I'm not saying you have to use one over the other. I just hope that this helps those of you who are only able to find Morton's wherever you are. Lately, I've been seasoning my briskets using the bus tub method, But just for the sake of mixing things up, I'm going to use a shaker. Few things that you need for a good shaker. You need one that's bigger than the amount of seasoning that you're going to use. I'm using the 16-ounce shaker. I want extra room to swirl around my seasoning. If you don't do that periodically, the salt and the pepper will start to separate because the grains weigh differently. You also want a cap with these big holes that I'll probably need to make even bigger later on. Put your salt and pepper into the shaker, mix it evenly, and it should look something like this. This brisket was trimmed yesterday and I've had it sitting out for about an hour or so it still has some tackiness. But just to ensure it's tacky enough, I'm going to give it a light spritz of some apple cider vinegar. And no, apple cider vinegar isn't some sort of secret to make sure your brisket is more tender, it just happens to be the liquid that's in my spray bottle. A lot of times I just use water. Flip the brisket over so it's fat side down first, because we always want to finish the presentation side last so we can keep it really nice and pretty. Now, as I start to season the bottom side, you can see that the shaker keeps getting stuck. I'm going to cut out one of the segments in between the holes so the coarse pepper doesn't get clogged. Please be careful when doing this. And when you take out a small piece, it should look something like this. And as you can see, it works much better now. Now, it may just look like I'm randomly dumping seasoning on top, but there's actually quite a bit of skill and practice that goes into using the shaker well. You need to get comfortable with seasoning from high up. You have to have good wrist control and spreads evenly. You also need to be conscious of when to stop when you see that the salt and pepper is starting to separate. And also learning how to use the palm and the back of your hand almost as a backboard to bank some of the seasoning off your hand on certain parts of the brisket that the shaker won't be able to reach. And there you go. We have a well-seasoned, evenly seasoned brisket using the shaker. We'll let this brisket sit out for just a little bit longer as we get the fire started. To set up your Kettle grill, make sure you remove as much ash as possible. We don't want it to obstruct airflow during the cook. Today, I'll be using my slow and sear with a water reservoir. If you don't have a slow and sear or a coal basket like this, you can definitely use the snake method or just mount some coals to one side as well. We're going to start off with some Fogo charcoal as our base, and as always, we're using some Korean newspaper, wrapping around a Fogo fire starter to create the ultimate flavor bomb to start our fire. Close the lid and let it heat up to about 240 to 260 degrees. Once it's up to temp, place the brisket furthest away from the fire, but also not touching the sides of the grill. We're going to do our best to pay attention to the corners that are against the wall, as those are the parts I'm worried about the most drying up. I also didn't have wood chunks ready to go, so I'm going to use this small split and keep it hovering over the coolest part of the fire. I'm going to spritz it every now and then and hope that it doesn't catch on fire. Now that we got our brisket placed, let's close the lid and leave it alone for the next few hours. During the first few hours of the cook, not much is going to happen to the brisket, so my main focus is going to be on how to adjust the vents on the top and the bottom to maintain temperatures. I haven't done a cook like this in a very long time, so fire management will be key. Just like any other brisket cook, there are certain things that don't change. Managing temperatures and airflow, and looking for certain cues to see that your brisket is on the right track. Here we are at the 5-hour mark. I also did a check about 3 hours in just because I was curious, but it pretty much looked the same as now, just with a lower internal temperature. And as you can see, the brisket has started to shrink and we're getting legitimate smoke from that one split that didn't catch on fire. There's some pooling, but nothing to worry about. All that's telling me is that we're on track and the brisket is starting to expel moisture properly. The edges are starting to tighten up, but there aren't any dried up corners because of how we trimmed the brisket earlier. And just to see where we're at, the point is temping at around 170 and the lean is right at about 160, which means we're right in the middle of the stall. At this point, I do need to rebuild my fire. I'm going to take the coals that are lit, pile them up onto one side, and throw fresh coals on top of it. It wasn't catching very well, but luckily I have my trusty pink fan with me, and within a few seconds, the coals were ready to go. Spritz the briskets if you feel like you need to, and we're going to close the lid again and we'll check on it in a few hours. We're back at about 10.5 hours. I did flip this brisket around the 7-hour mark just for fun. Right now, the brisket is looking real nice. The color is no longer that light brown and red tint. It has now become a very, very dark brown. We push through the stall, the fat on the top of the brisket isn't bouncing anymore. It's become soft and smushy. And even the sides of the lean have a slight give to them when I press it. This brisket is definitely ready to wrap. For this brisket, we'll also be using the foil boat method. I'm gonna show you guys how to do it the right way because Brad keeps telling me some of you still aren't doing it right. Get 2 pieces of foil and place them in a crisscross pattern. Drop the brisket in the center, and here's where the mistake is made. Rolling the foil towards the brisket is incorrect. When rolling up the foil on the edges, roll away from the brisket. And as you do so, it will create the boat around it. You might be saying, that feels weird and awkward and not intuitive, and what's the difference? It does feel strange until you see the reason why. When you roll away, you create a ridge around the boat that acts like handles around the brisket, which makes it so much easier to grab and move the brisket around. The extra lip of foil also allows you to cover up certain parts of the brisket that you might be worried got too dry already and may need a bit more protection with the foil. Now that we got this brisket wrapped up, it's gonna go back in the smoker at about 285-300 for the next hour or 2 until it's nice and tender. This brisket went back on the smoker for about an hour and a half and has been resting in my oven overnight for the last 13 hours. And as you can see, the bark has really set on top of the brisket. None of the edges are curled up, and if we pour the excess liquid found in the boat on top of the brisket, we can see that there's not that much liquid in there, which can either be a good thing or a bad thing. It could be bad because it means our brisket is dry, or it can mean a good thing because we properly expelled enough moisture during the cook and we didn't wrap up the brisket too early, which would leave a lot of extra liquid left in this foil boat. Let's cut a couple slices and see how we did. This brisket looks absolutely incredible. And I think I can say with confidence, having a little bit of liquid in the boat this time was a great thing. The lean is cutting beautifully, with the bark staying intact, and the fat is pretty well rendered. I would have liked to render it a little bit more, but I was worried I was going to dry out the brisket if I did. The point sliced beautifully as well, the marbling was still there, the rounded edge of the brisket wasn't shredding, but as I got towards the center of the brisket, it was getting a little bit mushy, but nothing that concerned me. But overall, I'm very happy with this cook. But let's give it a taste test. There's that lean that we sliced earlier. Let's pull it apart. I'm surprised by how much fat actually got rendered off. I'll say it's not as sweet as you would typically get on an offset. Next time I think I can trim it a little bit wider, just so we can have a bit bigger brisket. Let's get into this fatty portion right here. And you guys can see that fat is nice and rendered, nice crust from that foil boat. It's nice. Yeah. The lean is really good, and I was worried about that one so much because it sat in the stall forever. I thought this cook was gonna be done in like 9 to 10 hours. And I think this cook just goes to show you, if you guys understand how brisket cooks, you can cook on anything and you're trying to still chase certain milestones throughout the cook. And I hope you guys learned some new stuff in this video. You know, I've actually never really went in deep with the salt and pepper mix and doing it by weight, because I usually just do it by volume, but I used to do it by volume when I was using Morton's, and then a couple years ago I switched my salt to Diamond Crystal. So I needed to kind of go through that breakdown myself to figure out how much salt am I actually putting in and how much do I need. Definitely looking forward to trying again to make it even better. All right guys, so that's it for this video. And I know I say this a lot to share this video, but I feel like especially for you guys, or if you have friends who are trying to get into smoking brisket and all they have is a Kettle grill at home, please share this video with them. I want to make sure that those people who don't have offsets and things like that still know that they can put out a really great brisket, and you know, hopefully this video can help them out. I'm gonna say again, if you guys like this video, please make sure to like, subscribe, share this video with your friends, and I'll see you guys in the next one.